I've been enjoying this. I want to thank everybody for the kind words, and I want to thank especially Bill for taking the time to mention how cheap you and my dad are. That just blessed me. In preparing for this morning, I remembered my dad's words from another memorial service, my grandmother's. That was a little over 5 years ago, and it just so happened to be held on his 65th birthday. By that point, God's health was already in decline, and his cognition was affected by it, which makes, giving your thoughts to a room full of people a little more difficult. And I was watching him really anxiously. I'm just hoping he gets through and he does a good job, and he's making his way through his thoughts, and he gets to the end, and he says, "I would say of my mother," and he paused for like an eternity, and I'm just praying he's not like a deer in the headlights. And then his words come to him. He says, "I would say of my mother, she was just blessing, blessing, blessing." It was so dad. It was sweet, innocent, grateful, pure. It was perfect. So I don't know if there's any way that I can compete with blessing, blessing, blessing. But I've prepared some thoughts that I hope accurately reflect the amazing dad that I had. Psalm 1:3, it says, "The righteous man shall be like a tree, planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper." The metaphor of a tree suits my dad really well. A tree evokes a sense of duration and time. It unmistakably points to the idea of longevity. A giant oak tree only becomes that way after years, after decades of slow but sure growth. A tree is a picture of consistency. It's a picture of faithfulness, a lifetime of faithfulness. The righteous man shall be like a tree. He's planted. The verse is saying this is a guy who isn't going anywhere. He's going to be there day after day after day. You can trust him. You can rely on this guy. This is to break in case of emergency. To have that kind of security in your dad, that level of trust and assurance, what does that do for you as a child? How does that impact you? What's that worth? I don't have any way of quantifying what that's worth, but it was gold for me as a kid. I never worried about my dad. I never worried that he loved me. I never worried that he loved my mom or my siblings. I could put my full faith in my dad. Throughout my childhood and throughout his life, he displayed that patient, consistent, selfless faithfulness. I am so grateful. I'm so grateful that I had a dad who was like a tree. My dad was a proud father. He rooted for his children and he encouraged us. He was a supporter and a cheerleader. He did not hold back his affirmation or his kind words. I remember, I think I was maybe shortly out of high school, and my dad and I were talking, and he just gushed about how proud he was of his kids. He said, I just can't believe how you all turned out. He goes, "You're all smart, and you're funny, and you're athletic, and you're popular, and you're attractive." I said, "Dad, don't call me attractive." I have another memory of, I was maybe 8 years old, and I was playing Little League Baseball, and my dad, he gets my attention, he says, "Come over here." He goes, "Do you know what I just saw you doing?" And my life flashes before my eyes. "No, what was I doing?" And he says, "You've been going around the dugout, and you have been encouraging every single one of your teammates." He says, "I love that about you. I love that you are an encourager." I'm grateful that my dad was one. Soccer was my sport in junior high and high school, and I loved scoring goals because my dad was there, and he was always there. I could always count on hearing him shout from the sideline in the exact same cadence every time. "All right, Michael!" I would run back to our half of the field after scoring a goal. This is the truth. I would listen for my dad's voice every time. It's weird how these little things mean so much to you, But everybody be cheering, and I'm listening for my dad. And that might sound silly, But there is a reason why kids say, look what I can do, Dad. You know, did you see what I did, Dad? Are you watching, Dad? My dad had a childlikeness about him. He had an innocence and a sweetness and a purity that you typically only find in children. He somehow never lost that. He had that quality of goodness, of just being innately good. He was authentic and he was genuinely excited to see people. A Mark Meyer greeting was something like, "Wow, Bill Vogel!" Which, to be fair, Bill has that effect on all of us. My dad was easily contented. He required little and he nearly never complained. Even as my dad's cognition declined, I never heard him complain about it. We were talking one time and he was trying to tell a story, or he was trying to say something, and he lost his train of thought and he got visibly irritated. And I said, like, you know, it was a sad moment. And I said, Dad, I'm so sorry. And he goes, yeah, it's all right. It's just how it is now. When I was a little kid, I tried to make Saturday morning pancakes for the family once, but I couldn't quite figure out the heat on the stove, and I ended up with a bunch of burnt pancakes that looked like charcoal briquettes. Of course, nobody touched them except for my dad. He grabbed a few, applied butter and syrup, and said, "Thank you for making breakfast." When I did hear Dad complain, it was usually about something like politics. Another 4 years of Bill Clinton? Oh, brother. In the 1996 election, my dad had voted for the much more exciting presidential candidate, 73-year-old Bob Dole of Kansas. A guy who was about as dangerous as vanilla pudding, or as Dad called him, my kind of guy. His childlikeness was juxtaposed by the fact that he was a hardworking guy and extremely responsible. I have more thoughts, but that has been covered in detail. Something I loved about my dad was his humility. He was such a humble man. He was quietly confident, but he remained the picture of humility. And my dad wanted to pass that humility on to his children. The cars that my parents drove did just the trick. For years, they drove a 1990 ugly blue Plymouth Acclaim, formerly owned by a smoker. My parents nicknamed that car the Humility. And for us kids, that car had the added benefit of still smelling like cigarettes. That was great. My dad also instilled humility in his children when he barbered our hair. He had no professional training in barbering, and that didn't surprise anybody. One day I asked if my dad would spend the money for me to get a proper haircut. I've never seen him laugh so hard. He just laughed and he laughed and he laughed some more. When he finally composed himself, he sent me to my room for having, quote, a haughty spirit. That didn't actually happen. My dad was a ton of fun. Everybody's talked about it. I won't keep going on, but I love that I had a dad who he was like, I already said he was childlike. I love that I had a dad who just tried to make life fun for his kids. I realized that my dad was really one of the good ones when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And I tagged along with him one day as he visited his rental property to have a chat with his tenant. The tenant was there with his own son, who was maybe 4 or 5. The adults start talking, and the tenant makes a joke, and he says, "Yep, homes sure are expensive." And he looks his little boy in the eye and he goes, "Almost as expensive as little kids." And my dad, it sounds fake, or it sounds like it's out of a movie or something, but it happened just like this. My dad, he bent down on one knee, put his hand on that little kid, and he goes, "But you are so much more valuable." That was my dad. What a dad. What a guy I had. What a guy he was. I'll close with an observation about parenting in general and about my father in specific. As you're raising children, you're trying to give them some sort of a compass, some sort of a roadmap to help them navigate life. You're trying to pass on whatever truths you hold and whatever wisdom you think you may possess. You do your best to show them the way. You ask them to trust you and maybe even to follow your example. And while you're trying to deliver your truths and your wisdom and your instruction, this is the hard part, they're watching you all the time. They have nearly unrestricted access to your life. They get to weigh what you say against what you do. They have every opportunity to sniff out your mistakes, your hypocrisies, your shortcomings. And then they reach a certain point where they're old enough to make their own decisions, and they get to decide if they buy what you've been selling to them. In a sense, they get to decide if they buy you. When I think about my dad's life and who he was, I buy it. I look at his example and I say, I want to be like my dad. In so many ways, I want to be like my dad. Proverbs 10:7 says, the memory of the righteous is blessed. The memory of Mark Meyer certainly is bad. And I can't think of a better way to close than to say of my dad, he was just blessing, blessing, blessing.